So we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here. This basically has been made possible because our department received an endowment in honor of Professor Peter Ossorio that supports not only this lecture series and the lecture today, but also provides an ongoing source of funding for graduate students, and particularly graduate students in the clinical psychology program who've made contributions in descriptive psychology, health behavioral psychology, or clinical psychology. So the first student recipient is Brianna Robustelli. So please stand up and congratulations. So the endowment itself was created by Drs. Roxy Schell and Damon Tempe. And Dr. Tempe completed his Ph.D. here in our department in 1974 under the mentorship of Dr. Ossorio, and decided to honor the man, these are quotes, who was so encouraging of his work towards his Ph.D. So Professor Ossorio is said to have set a standard of intellectual precision and rigor, and is best known as the creator of a conceptual framework called descriptive psychology. This approach emphasizes the task of describing something accurately as a necessary precursor to creating theories about it. This framework has been applied to disciplines beyond the field of psychology to include artificial intelligence, economics, and research methodology. With this in mind, it is fitting that Dr. Wynn Schwartz is the inaugural speaker in the Ossorio Fund Lecture Series. Dr. Schwartz received his Ph.D. in 1977 from CU Boulder in the clinical psychology program under the mentorship of Dr. Ossorio. Dr. Schwartz is currently faculty at William James College and a lecturer at Harvard Medical School and the president of the Society for Descriptive Psychology. So please help me welcome him. Thank you.
I'm going to stand up, sit down, just whatever, so, we'll have to see how it goes. A couple of framework statements. I'm going to start, once I start, I'm going to start at a pretty high level of abstraction and point to a very, very broad map. It's just indicative of what the subject matter of descriptive psychology concerns itself with, which I will then not honor. What I will do instead is take a very narrow segment of it, make some comments about that, and then do something even narrower. So I'm going to start by talking about the problem that Ossorio and many others faced by the 1960s. How Ossorio conceptualized the problem, how many of his students who came into the program at that time also recognized problems in psychology. Then I'm going to describe the solution, the program that Ossorio developed as a way of trying to remedy a problem. From that, I'm going to describe the major conceptual framework, which I'm just going to point to and make some very brief comments about, and then narrow it down to a description of one component, the notion of intentional action. And then from that, I'm going to show how one can use that framework for structuring inquiries about empathy and empathic action. As we get more towards the end of what I'll talk about, the marker of whether or not I'm even vaguely successful will be whether it seems practical, whether specifically when I'm describing a framework for understanding empathic engagement and a checklist, whether I'm providing a framework that seems of utility. The earlier stuff is likely to engage so many different kinds of intellectual themes that we're not going to make any headway about that, although at the end, if we want to look at some of that, we can play with it. So that's my battle plan. When I entered graduate school in 1972, the general feeling among at least many in the sort of intellectual community, especially when looking at psychology from the outside, was that in psychology we had, as Wittgenstein put it, experimental method and conceptual confusion. That we had very refined methodologies, but no there. No way to anchor those methodologies in an understanding of a primary subject matter. There was a general climate of dissatisfaction with the foundations of the behavioral sciences, which I'll contentiously argue still exists. But the climate has changed considerably at this period in terms of how those problems are approached from when Ossorio, I think, entered the field. This is Peter. Those of us who were his student knew him as Pete. What he's going to do over a 40-year period is to clearly identify those features of the existing critiques of psychology and the behavioral sciences that seem to hold water, and there are many. And what he is then going to offer, which is unlike any other intellectual enterprise that I'm aware of, and I'm moderately educated, and I've been doing this for 40 years, there is nothing else that has actually approached this, the scale, the systematic and extensive scale of providing a solution. The solution, however, as we'll see, is not psychology in its traditional sense. And that's going to be one of the first dilemmas that I think Ossorio faced as a teacher of this material, which is that it was recognizably, in many ways, not psychology, but a discipline in and of itself. And that is one of the first hurdles, which I'll try to identify. But he provided a systematic solution to a problem that some people thought was of extraordinary significance, and others maybe not so much. The problem that Ossorio saw, and I'll read his comments. There were five essential problems that he wanted to identify, at least in a publication where he clarified why he went about this enterprise. The first was that psychological theory and method are clearly almost entirely non-empirical, yet no satisfactory account of this has been available. Now, I don't want to get, the only thing I want to say about that is that the conceptual foundations, the notions of behavior, the logical connections among aspects of the subject matter were simply not explicitly identified. That there was no rigorous clarification of the difference between a conceptualization, the empirical engagement, the collecting of data, and then the theories about why the particular patterns occurred. Ossorio was less interested in the data and the concept and the why particular patterns occurred, although he developed methodologies for looking at that, but how to conceptualize the subject matter before you go out there and look to see how it actually happens. He also thought that psychological theories of methodology and psychological theories of behavior were inadequate to provide any kind of framework for clinical practice. After I left here and moved to Boston, I then took another decade and a half to get trained as a classical psychoanalyst, fortunately under the auspices as a research analyst. So I was permitted to point out the bullshit that was endemic, because I could point it out as an insider. In psychoanalysis and psychoanalytic psychodynamic theories, in its historical form, we had on the one hand a kind of classic rigid determinism of sheer cause and effect engagement, and we had a therapeutic practice that was supposed to involve personal liberation, the expansion of choice. Those themes in some ways nicely illustrated one of the problems that Ossorio was interested in. At the point of the 60s and 70s, and I think some would argue remains the case, there was no general theory in psychology that was adequate to account for language as a form of behavior. And these themes remained intensely focused within through the 50s, through the 1980s, I think. Finally, for him, there was the whole set of intractable truth issues associated with traditional theorizing, in which theory was supposed to prove that things were involved in proofs, which clearly is not the case. One of the things that the model of theorizing and scientific endeavor that Ossorio became interested in and developed was how what we do with our theoretical work is we don't prove things, but we end up showing whether it makes sense to talk the way we're talking, whether we've created something intelligible, whether our manner of engagement is vindicated by the patterns that we observe. Proof being a matter of logic and of mathematics. In psychology, we build a case that's acceptable, that's unacceptable, that's well-formed, that's not well-formed, that allows us to continue to effectively or ineffectively act, given our data set. Those were his concerns, which I'm not going to say more about. His students had another group of concerns, similar to these. One set of concerns was that the biological reductionism and rigid determinism of the manners in which, as undergraduates, most of us have been taught to think about psychology, made it impossible for us to also systematically consider the everyday questions of accountability, of responsibility, the legal notions of blame. The whole set of moral language became very, very problematic. We asked the question, can we talk about understanding things in ways that don't require simply the language of causality? When is it appropriate to talk about reasons for things happening rather than causes? That set of concerns, I think, was one that had, at least amongst those students who had a kind of philosophical and humanistic background along with their psychology, were bringing into the classroom. A more problematic theme. Well, let me start by the way the problem occurred to me last week in the classroom. Student asked another student, well, what are you comfortable with, psychodynamics or cognitive behavioral? What's your orientation? By the 60s, it was pretty clear that the existing personality theories, the grand narratives, looked more like theology than any kind of grounded science. There was no common subject matter that allowed a person to go from a set of cognitive, behavioral, existential, psychodynamic themes and coherently talk across the disciplines. There was no middleware. There was no common language to tell whether people were talking about the same things or something else. And worse, or better, depending on how you think about these things, our students, and my students are still in many ways taught to approach their neighbors, their fellow students' theory of comfort. Am I psychodynamic or am I behavioral? To approach it the way you approach your neighbor's incorrect but respectable religion. Can you imagine a physicist talking to another physicist and asking, well, are you psychodynamic or are you behavioral? What do you believe? Now, maybe you get that in some of the looser areas of the subject matter, but a foundation that allowed people to know whether they were talking about the same thing, whether they're on the same page, was absent. Instead, we had these personality theories that existed sort of like silos of knowledge, often with very detailed, very elegant formulations and with reasonably good understandings within a certain kind of language game, but unable to compare or contrast their concepts, their recognitions with people in other areas of psychology. The other problem, which I think also remains, and it's kind of it doesn't make us look good as psychologists, which is that we lack a common lexicon. We lack a common base of language. I mean, electrical engineers sometimes in the middle 1800s decided, well, if we talk about a volt, we talk about an ohm, we talk about resistance, let's agree on certain ways we're going to measure these things and talk about these things, so at least we're on the same page, so we don't burn each other, we don't electrocute each other. Let's get something common. They still had trouble with metrics and inches, but by and large, there was a kind of people got together and they agreed on the kind of language that they would use, which meant they had to systematically coordinate the sensibility of their language. Think of the different ways we talk about identification or ego or drive or motivation or behavior. We often think we're talking about the same thing because we're using the same words, but you know, method and language may pass one each other by. Ossorio's solution to this problem developed over about a 40-year period, which I'm just going to very briefly describe. He called the, well, before I get to that, there was a certain vantage point he took on the world. It's a vantage point that was already familiar to some from areas of analytic and linguistic philosophy, was already appreciated by those with a kind of pragmatic background. But the first orienting sort of slogan or way of looking at the world was the idea that the world makes sense. That the world is not inherently mysterious, nor are people inherently mysterious. They make sense. And I'm trained within a subject matter that treats people from the beginning as if most of your behavior is unconscious, as if you don't know what the hell you're doing, as if the significance of your action somehow is, you know, you still want to screw your mother. If inherently our behavior was driven by motivations outside of the awareness, outside of our awareness, outside of the significances we could attend, how could we hold hands and walk across the street together? The grounds for shared social practice would be entirely lacking. So the argument that I build in my classes is that the misunderstandings among people, the mysteries amongst people are the exception rather than the rule. The rule is a general kind of common understanding. Another orienting principle is that it's one world, that everything fits together, everything is related to everything else. And this is going to be expressed in what I'll show next, which is the top-down person concept. Things are what they are, not something else instead. The world is, you know, well, as Wittgenstein describes his toolbox of having a screwdriver, a hammer, a saw, a plane, a glue box, you need a lot of different kind of irregular tools to construct the world, to construct behavior. That the multiplicity of our engagements, the irregular nature of our behavior, has to be respected, while still finding a way to connect everything to everything else. And that the problems of reductionism at that point, that everything is really a drive, or everything is really from an instinct, or everything is really a cause and effect, everything is really to be understood as a stimulus and a response. Any of the root metaphors of the world is simply an organism, or the world is simply a machine, the things should simply be understood in terms of context or form, any of these sort of grand reducing narratives ended up distorting the actual complexity that we deal with. Which leads to the fourth point, which is don't count on the world being simpler than it has to be. Where Ossorio takes on a position somewhat similar to Whitehead's, in which, you know, look for parsimony when you can find it, seek simplicity but distrust it. His solution, in part, was a map that he called the person concept, of which I'm only going to really spend some time looking at just this one feature. The person concept starts with this top-down recognition that every idea of the world is somebody's idea, that it is us as persons who are engaged in understanding, interacting with the terrain, that the knowledge of the world is a person's knowledge of the world, and that to construct an adequate foundation for the behavioral sciences, you need to interrelate these four themes. The individual person, language as verbal behavior, behavior as intentional action, and the world, the stage. And he explicitly unfolded and interconnected each of these ideas to create a map of what he called the person concept. He also is going to develop two methodologies that are of use. One he's going to call a paradigm case formulation, in which you start with, in this case, this is a paradigm case formulation of a person, in which you start with I mean, the dilemma is how hard it is to define certain things. I'm going to approach the question of empathy in a bit. But defining what a person is has proven to be an extraordinarily difficult kind of task. It may be apocryphal, but one of the stories that was told about Ossorio, about part of what led him to some of these notions of the person concept, was a NASA problem, which is, as he put it, if green gas on the moon speaks to an astronaut, how do we know whether or not it's a person? How do we understand what we mean by persons, apart from a particular biology, a particular physiology, a particular biologic form? Are there qualities? And this is something that's become quite of significance, at least in the animal rights community. I was at a set of lectures at Yale last year about the question of Stephen Weiss's lawsuits about limited personhood for the chimps. The question of many of the primates, the big cetacea, the space people, robots. There's all sorts of kinds of questions where the notion of what do we mean by a person, what do we mean by a person legally, and it turns out that the law actually did have a fairly robust understanding of this concept, but that we didn't have it in psychology. And so part of what Ossorio developed was a notion of persons, and this is some of the aspects of it that I used for to raise questions about the great apes. The paradigm case methodologies, the way they work, is you find a case that everybody can agree. If there was ever the case of that being a person, well, that's the paradigm case. So you look for something that's the most complicated, archetypal, indubitable. By God, if there was ever a case of a chair, well, that's a chair. And so once you have a paradigm case where everybody agrees, well, we will all agree to call that a person, or we'll call that a family, or we'll call that a chair, then you can start removing or adding features. And with each addition or removal, some people continue to say, well, that's a person, that's a chair, and some people say, I don't think so. But with each of these changes, you're now in a systematic place to say, well, but I understand now your grounds for disagreement. So you at least can have a systematic place to begin to share a subject matter, the paradigm case, in which you start to remove or change features so you can at least find out where the disagreement lies. And that's part of what we did for the question of the personhood of the apes, which seems to focus somewhat on the issue of the range of motivations available and the span of what we might want to call language. But that's not most of what I want to talk about. I'm going to ignore verbal behavior, except to say that Ossorio is looking at it in a very pragmatic way, that we understand language, verbal behavior as involving concepts being a conceptual distinction that you can act on in some way, a distinction that has meaning and behavior, a locution, a way of symbolically representing that through some kind of utterance. It could be gesture, it could be speech, it could be image. It's just a way to communicate it. And a behavior that it represents. Similar to Wittgenstein's notion of language games. The world, in which the stage in which the action occurs, involves the state of affairs of objects, processes, events, concepts, and relationships. All of this is going to be interconnected. What I'm going to focus on, however, is just this one feature, which is the one that I find most useful in the classroom, which is the parametric analysis of behavior. What do I want to say about that? Parametric analyses. The point of a parametric analysis is to, first we have the paradigm case, which shows a general case of agreement, and then you can look at the parameters of an example. The parameters should be such that in locating the values on each of the parameters, one is in a position to describe how, in this case of behavior, how any behavior is alike or different from any other behavior. So it's a bookkeeping method. It's a way to map out how one act is like another act. It provides a kind of common language. And the common language, I think that this actually does a very good job of unfolding, has turned out to be one of the trickiest issues that we see from neuroscience through psychology at large. It shows up in almost all of the of the behavioral sciences, which is what the hell do we mean by intentionality? We'll be seeing writers who will talk about, yeah, intentionality is what's at issue here, but it's kind of fuzzy in terms of what we mean by it. Well, what I'm going to suggest is it's actually not fuzzy at all. But it does require a lot of explicit identification of the moving parts, if you will. Some of these moving parts, I think Ossorio identified as inherent in an action that is purposeful or goal-directed. Some of them, he extracted from the works of writers like Gilbert Ryle, the KH parameter, which I'll say something about. Others, like significance, could be found in Elizabeth Anscombe's work. Now, by parameters, you all know about parameters, because you all took, somewhere you had plane geometry in the 8th grade, the x and y axis, or the varied color parameters, hue, saturation, brightness, and this changes from time to time in terms of how you can identify a color as similar or different. Everything in plane geometry falls somewhere on the x and y axis. What Ossorio presented, and to this date I've not seen a better way of going about it, is that you can use these distinctions to identify the full set of behaviors. And if you can't, and this is what I think one of the beautiful features of this kind of methodology, if it turns out that there's a behavior or a distinction that doesn't fit here, you add it on. In the early patterns in Ossorio's first writings about behavior, KH was not well identified. Somewhere along the line, in sort of focusing on Ryle's concept of mind and other works, or it just became necessary to pull it out, the know-how parameter got added. So, what's a behavior? And I'm going to take it for granted that for most of us as psychologists, we're interested in behavior. For many of us as psychologists, we're interested in those behaviors that have, in folk terms, are intentional behaviors. And I'm separating those behaviors from things that are accidents or reflexes. So I'm talking about behavior that is meaningful, that has a purpose, that's trying to accomplish something, that's goal-directed. In contrast to behaviors, to movements, to procedures, to performances that are reflex, that are accidents, that one can't assign meanings or significance to. This is the bookkeeping device, which I'll then use to briefly talk about empathy. Also, using these kind of bookkeeping devices, you can create structured interviews for all sorts of problems. These are the kind of distinctions that you can wonder about when you wonder about somebody's behavior or a set of behaviors. The first is that every behavior is somebody's behavior. It's the actor. Joe, Wynn, the man in the dark hat, the policeman over there. It's just a simple device for identifying that by naming the character involved in the action. Also, when you simply use these parameters, you're not yet in a position to indicate whether you're talking about animal behavior at large, the specific behavior of persons, which we're going to define as involved with deliberate action. Should be a general way to map out most of the distinctions that we're concerned about.
Wynn, it's also handy if you're building a robot.
Yes. Yes. One of the first questions we ask about behavior is, well, why did it happen? And the general answer for why things happen when we're talking about meaningful behavior is that it involves something the actor wants to accomplish. The behavior is motivated, that there's reasons for it. The second question we often ask about behavior isn't just, well, he did something because he did something he wanted to do. And what he wants may have a multiplicity of reasons. Hedonic, prudent, ethical, and aesthetic, a whole host of things that go into why we do what we do. But the basic notion is that the behavior is motivated by trying to accomplish something. But why did it happen now? That we answer by pointing to something that the actor knows or distinguishes in the current circumstances. There's an opportunity or a dilemma that needs acting on. That that the actor can distinguish something in their circumstance relative to something that they want, some value, some set of standing conditions, and now gives them an opportunity to try to get it. Behavior is motivated by opportunity and dilemma. The stage I find myself on has this room is full of opportunity and hazard, given my own desire to be intelligible and my narcissistic concerns with looking foolish, my worries about how my speech is coming apart, whether or not there's all sorts of stuff going on in here, as it is for you. I distinguish, I'm here, I'm Wynn, I want to give this lecture for all sorts of reasons. It makes me look good in my home department. I want to talk about this stuff. I see some old friends that I'm really happy to see here. This is sort of a homecoming for me. And I'm on a mission to teach this stuff. So there's all sorts of things I'm doing that I want to do. I recognize an opportunity because you guys showed up, so you're here, so I'm here, so I'm trying to make use of the opportunity and the dilemma. The dilemma meaning that I could, screw it up, I could, discredit the subject matter, I could lead you down a path, or maybe I might make you a bit interested in this, which would be, in some ways, the essential accomplishment. But it's not just that I recognize an opportunity for behavior to occur in a non-accidental fashion. I also have some competence, some know-how to apply to it. The pitcher who can throw a fastball regularly at 90 miles an hour didn't throw that fastball that way the first time. He acquired that know-how, that competence through practice and experience. The umpire understands the strike zone, has some of the same knowledge base, also knows what he thinks the pitcher is trying to accomplish, but may not have the competent skill to throw it itself. That what one recognizes and wants is conceptually distinguishable from what one knows how to do. In fact, one of, I think, the clearest ways to gauge anxiety in your clients is when you recognize that a client, that a patient sees an opportunity or dilemma. Opportunities are big on this list to get something they want, but they don't have the competence to get it. To the extent that one lacks the competence or believes one lacks the competence to go after something that one wants, those situations are often threatening, often are experienced as anxiety provoking. But know-how means that I know I got some adequate set of skills, some competencies that I learned through practice and experience. You don't see any of this, however. You don't see any of that. All of that is going to be logically presupposed before there is any behavior at all. What you see is the implementation, the procedure that occurs in real time, that has a beginning and has an end. Well, you can define the end in a variety of ways. That's interruptible. You see the wind-up of the pitch. You see me, walking across the stage. But being a person in the world of persons, being who we are, you're in a position to recognize me, to have some appreciation of what it is I'm trying to do, of, as you listen to me, some appreciations of what we share in terms of concepts so that we're able to communicate. You'll make your own judgment about how competent I am at doing it. But you won't know you won't have direct access to my motivation, my knowledge, my know-how. That's actor's knowledge. That's something I know, I feel. What you have access to is the performance, what you see me doing. And the achievement, the difference it makes. The difference as simple as moving this water from here, taking a drink, to here, or as profound as the possibility that I might actually get you interested in the subject matter. What you observe are performances and achievements, which we often confuse with the behavior itself. Behaviors have a significance, what I'm up to, and as an analyst, that's how I make my bread and butter, which is wondering, well, what are you doing by doing that? What does that get you? What are the implications of that? What the actor's up to. And then further personal characteristics, which is what personal characteristic is being expressed by the behavior. And with each of these, you can have an unfolding set of questions about how one acquired these things, how stable they remain, how they change over time, how they engage with other actors. These again, so these are parameters, not entirely different from a set of distinctions, the distinctions being IWK, KHPA, etc. In descriptive psychology, we tend to make use of a shorthand for this, which I'm just going to illustrate because I need it to make the next point, in which we represent intentional action through this kind of diamond, in which an ongoing behavior can be identified in terms of what the actor wants, including this set of motivations, which I'm not able to really talk about, except that two of them in particular, aesthetic and ethical, require what I'm going to describe just briefly as the possibility of deliberate action. So they're quintessentially aspects of the motivations of persons, apart from the motivations of those objects that were not, or animals or things that we're not likely to grant full personhood to, although we might. That's a decision that a judge makes. But imagine yourself in the company of a whole group of people who, had no ethical or aesthetic standards. I mean, my dog, for example, I trust with my life, but not my lunch. There's all sorts of themes that one, a few chimps that I've had some engagements with, there's some quality of aesthetics, and there's certainly some choices going on, but it's not that robust, it's not very developed. Hedonics and prudence, things done for pleasure, or pain, or disgust, things done for self-interest or protection. Those are the ones that were most generally explored in our earlier psychologies, in our psychoanalytic theories, in our behavioral theories. These being ones that are more, that really require another set of concepts, the concepts of deliberateness. We represent cognizant action or self-aware action, and this starts to allow me to move towards the theme of empathy, by a person knowing their own action. And the question marks here are important, because what the question marks are about, and this is going to become significant in a moment when I talk about empathy, is that one only knows oneself or knows anything more or less. You always know enough to act. You got no choice there. But you're always acting on some degree of uncertainty. It's specifically as clinicians that we often aren't going to intervene based on trying to make corrections in terms of a person's motivational hierarchy, the adequacy or accuracy of what they recognize in a situation, what they know how to do, their competence in that situation, the style of performance, and its significance. But all of that we can either know a lot about or know just some about. But this will serve as part of the basis for a checklist of inquiry when behavior is not going right, when there's reason to ask, well, how come things didn't turn out the way I thought they would? Then sometimes the answer is, well, let's look if there's a misunderstanding in one of these parameters, which I'll say a bit more about. I'm just going to briefly describe this and then I'll get right to the theme of empathy before we run out of time. So there are three roles, three jobs that every person, every paradigm case person can perform. We can act. In the general case of action that we're describing, and we're calling intentional action, goal-directed action. One variety of intentional action is cognizant action, self-aware action, in which I'm aware of what I'm doing, in which my knowledge is of what I'm doing, of my action. I know the action performed. And when things are going fine, that's all it really takes. However, I may deliberately decide to change the course of my action because it's going wrong or it's not getting what I want. And it's in these cases that we talk about the role of critic as self-regulating. That I recognize as a deliberate actor that there are a variety of versions of how I could go about doing what I'm trying to do. Versions that I may have greater or lesser certainty about, greater or lesser knowledge about. But that this is a self-corrective feedback loop. And using this kind of model, it becomes relatively easy to train people on all sorts of themes of psychopathology and of where one can intervene therapeutically. The therapist often serves as an auxiliary critic by providing clarity about the options that were available that the actor didn't know at the time of the problematic action. little wound up. Empathic action. What the hell is empathy? It's treated like a big mystery. Since the 40s and 50s, it's been considered the heart and soul of the psychodynamic therapies. It's always sort of front and center amongst the Rogerians, the humanists, and the existential therapists. The cognitive behaviorists, when they do their job well, they do it well because they actually have a good empathic understanding of the person they're working with, so they know what's appropriate. I'm not just going to describe empathy here as a quality of feeling. I don't have access to your qualities or your feelings directly. But I'm going to use this as a general model in which an operationalization of sorts, which I'll make a little more explicit in a second, which is that, and I'm appealing to these parameters, which is, if empathy, and I think empathy is ordinary. I think it's an ordinary feature of engagement. I think for the most part, there's nothing special about it. There are things that can be, more or less profoundly, special, especially when you're dealing with somebody who's very difficult to understand or to be with. Somebody that is very difficult to manage your feelings about when you're close to them. And I'll have just one or two words to say about mirror neurons in this respect. But that empathic engagement, the relational features of empathy involve, well, what does it feel like to me when I think somebody is empathizing with me? Well, it feels to me that they have an accurate, time-present appreciation of my motivation, what motivates me now, my values as present now, what I recognize in the circumstance I'm trying to deal with, and what skills, what competence I have to deal with that problem in the present. Do I feel adequate to the task, inadequate to the task? What do I know about what's required here? What do I want to accomplish? And especially as they recognize the significance of what I'm trying to do in my terms. Not their terms, but my terms. They know so they know what's at stake for me. That's what is involved in empathic action, with one other fundamental rider, which shows up in the sort of the key teachers of the subject, from Roy Schaefer to Heinz Kohut to Carl Rogers, which is that what makes an engagement empathetic, in contrast to simply a raw knowing of the other, is that one represents to the other in their understanding of that other person in a way that that person can tolerate being understood, in which one doesn't feel violated, stripped. One feels appreciated in terms of one's vulnerability, so empathy often has that kind of intimate quality. It's safe to show, the vulnerability. It's not ruthless, which is why in therapy we think about timing and tact in terms of our interpretations, our interventions. Very briefly, if we want to talk about mirror neurons and affect, because we think about empathy often in terms of how it is I feel what the other feels. Well, to the extent that that's a significant feature, and it very well I think is, that's also an aspect of what we know about the other. We may know about the other because of what that other evokes in us in terms of our own feeling states. So that's part of the signal, that has signal value, if you will. It may have more than signal value, because it may turn out that it may show up all sorts of other maps of intentionality that connect to what the person is doing beyond what's simply observed, which is how we understand significance as a parameter. A little more detail. Again, we're going to have Will and Gil. They're classic kind of characters in Ossorio's work. An empathic cognizant action involves, well, we got Will and we got Gil here. Will doesn't have access to these things directly. What Will is observing is Gil's performance and achievement, what Gil is doing, and is forming a representation of Gil, specifically of the significance of what Gil is doing. When we know people, we're thinking about primarily as well, what are they about? What are they doing? What are they trying to accomplish? What does it mean to them? At greater or lesser degrees of specificity, given our concerns, given the engagement, our social practice. From that, what I'm aware of, what I may wonder about, or what I may know, what I will treat as the facts in front of me, is my uncertain knowledge of what the person wants, knows, and couple of other features about this. I'll think about Gill in terms of the cultural norms. There's all the history of how he got there. All of this will be features that will come into my understanding of the significance of that action, which I will only know more or less. When we take this theme of empathy out of the ordinary and move it into the realm of, say, the I-thou relationship, part of what is inherent in an empathic engagement is the respect for the uncertainty, the non-presumption of knowing what one doesn't know, the respect for the mystery that still remains, the respect for the uncertainty, the therapeutic regard that I have not got you pegged, that I'm here for us to together try to understand who you are as you will agree to show me. And further, as I'm evoking in you, because this engagement between us as a social practice isn't you're just doing what you're doing in an arbitrary random fashion, you're doing it with me. So I'm an evocative feature in your world, given my presentation. In writers like Fonagy's notions of mentalization, we have a version of the I-thou relationship in which what we know about the other is we're able to represent an adequate map of the other's intentional action as a deliberate actor. We know the other is making choices in a manner similar to the way we might make choices. But we respect the fact that it may be based on different sets of motives, which is the theme of thou. So we know Gill as deliberate. I'm used to like a 2-hour lecture period. So I don't think my students are used to a 2-hour lecture period, but that's, I pee before I start, so I'm okay. So, here's the tool. Here's a tool. I think it's a pretty useful tool. That's pretty good about it. It's working for me. We've used this in research projects for structured interviews. I use it in supervision frequently because in a supervisory relationship, I train supervisors who train supervisors through the Harvard system. What my supervisee tells me about his clients is hearsay. I know what they're doing with me. I know what they're telling me about them. And I know that the two of us are probably getting along, or not. But I have to hear their descriptions of what's going on out there. And so as I listen to those descriptions, I'm wondering, what makes sense to me, what doesn't make sense? What more do I want to know? And I find, when behavior seems to be going well, when there's an attunement, when the dance unfolds in a nice improvisational fashion, when we're holding hands successfully as we dance across the street singing our tunes, there's no question to be raised, generally, unless you want to talk about, let's change the tune. It's when empathy breaks down, when attunement or engagement breaks down, as it often does in therapy, because as therapists, we're generally or frequently dealing with difficult people. That's why they pay us to, that's how we make our living, by exposing ourselves and engaging in difficult situations and trying to offer a degree of decency and maybe teach them some skills. But when it breaks down, how do we get back that attunement? Or when I'm trying to figure out what the hell my supervisee is telling me, and I need more specificity in their descriptions, what can I ask? Well, I go to this checklist often enough, and I'll describe it as just a tool, because it's like, why not? If you've got a checklist, why not use one? So a question I could ask was, given their of the other person, the person I'm trying to understand, and now have had either a breakdown in our relationship, or I'm trying to get somebody else to explain to me what's going on, I can ask, well, given their understanding of the overall situation, what does this person want to have happen? What are they trying to accomplish? What do they want? What motivations might be at play for this person? The second question, and that's the W parameter, the second question is, what exactly do they recognize in this circumstance relevant to what they want, including how they want to be seen by me? Big deal, how they want to be seen by the person they're talking to. Who am I to them? The K parameter. Who are they responding to? How am I a significant feature of the stage of engagement? And, especially important, given what they want to have happen, given what they recognize as the circumstances call for, given who they see me as a participant, what do they know how to do given that? What competencies do they have to bring to bear on the problem? Are they competent to manage the current circumstance? Is something that looks straightforward, like you should behave properly here and not get all angry and burnt out of shape, or that you should sit quietly in your seat, or I don't know, understand why you're anxious, is that because the person, doesn't feel they have the adequate competence, values, or knowledge to engage in those circumstances in the way they would ordinarily think to be appropriate? If you ask a person to do something that they can't do, they'll do something they can do. A basic maxim. Do they have the competence to manage the current circumstance? This one I go to almost all the time when, as I said before, I'm trying to understand features of reactive depression and panic and anxiety. What's the significance to them of what they achieve? If I fall on my face, in front of my class at William James, I'm going to be upset for a day. I'll be upset for 2 days. I still got issues. But the next week, if I do it really well, I'll feel restored. This is just a one-shot affair for you guys, for most of you guys. So, the odds are a little higher. Fortunately, I won't get enough feedback to know how I did, so I'm going to maintain whatever illusion and denial serves my purposes. But what's the significance of the engagement? How does it matter? Does it matter like not at all, or is it really important? How does it matter to them? What personal characteristics are they employing here? And how significant are those characteristics to them? What does this tell me about the kind of person they are? Their standing conditions, their true colors, if you will. The personal characteristics and significance parameter. And finally, and most importantly in many ways, if this is an ongoing engagement and intimacy, is will they appreciate and tolerate my presentation of my understanding? Little private laugh. When I did my doctoral defense here, all these methodologists were there. I did this study on hypnosis where I actually found, and then the method was wrong. I had to redo it the following year, and published both versions showing about hypnosis and episodic memory. Pete's advice to me was, okay, run down the clock. Just keep going. And they gave me the degree. So I've run down the clock pretty much. This is, I've given you like this slice, and an idiosyncratic slice, a slice that reflects my version of the subject matter. What I've not given you is anything except a kind of promissory note that there is this actual map out there that I think is extraordinarily, first it's beautiful, it's elegant. It does justice to our condition, and it can be further refined. And that's, that's the game I like playing. So thank you.
So we have time for some questions, and if some of you need to leave at 5, feel free to leave. So go ahead, Jerry.
And I just want to thank you for your talk. I came here in 1980 when Ossorio was basically on his last hurrah. I never hardly met him, and no one really knew what he was doing. It wasn't in clinical. So I want to say thank you for sharing this sort of very interesting overview of what he was about, because I had no idea.
What I also didn't say a word about, this was a man of extraordinary generosity of spirit and time. Of a guy who could, instantly point out that your thoughts are a little wacky here, and it was okay. Where there was no degradation in being, constructively engaged and corrected.
I think I might be the only one that's in the room right now. Alice was. I was going to ask you, but we just didn't get. We never knew him. And the other thing, and any clinicians left in the room? No, I was really interested in because I was in going through you're building a sort of interesting checklist of things to be aware of when I'm not a clinician at all, And so, but I always wondered what you guys did. but laying it out in that.
We wonder that ourselves.
Yeah,
Which is the issue.
I thought it was pretty. It was very interesting in terms of laying out the different categories of questions that you were sort of checking against. In some ways, it reminded me. I did do a lot of sports training and listening to people who, where you're getting into really understanding people's motives for the sport. Do they have the competencies? I saw many of the same sorts of things I would be concerned with if I was trying to coach somebody.
It's right. The group of people that I find are the quickest to understand this are people in journalism and people that do stage work, that do theater, because of the thoughts of these kinds of distinctions, the sort of distinctions you need to hold in mind in order to tell a story or to direct it.
So what I was going to ask you of my clinical colleagues is, here I see an objective list of things that you could run off. How does that correspond to what we do now? Mark, you're up.
Oh, you're the clinician. You can tell us.
No. I was curious about. No, is that? I mean, I could see a lot of those things seem to be what I would think would be
Common
not
sense.
far from common sense.
Yeah, common sense.
Of the kinds of things we play in everybody's lives, right? And so a lot of them have to be things that
90% of what I'm doing as an analyst involves this.
Yeah, and that's I assume that
And the other 10% involves
it
being
pretty
quiet.
maps on.
I think they map on to quite a few things.
In many ways, and so I was just curious as to, but what I did appreciate that it was laying out in a pretty coherent framework. At first, I didn't think I was going to get to a place where I was going to find it interesting, but then you did.
So I'm supposed to pay you when we had described the payment schedule.
So anyway, that's my comment.
Other thoughts, questions, comments?
Well, for what clinical students we have around, I just wanted to put out a reminder that in a gathering like this, I look around and I see 1, 2, 3, 4 people who have been in clinical practice for around 50 years succeeding. Some of them breaking new ground by taking on different kinds of clients that have been taken on before. So if you get a chance to hijack these guys, it might be fun.
Teresa, you had it.
Yeah, I was just curious if anyone had done a parametric analysis, to use your words, from that checklist, or not checklist, but that list of parameters of something like development in children.
Yes. There's almost development is mapped out. We actually have people here who probably have some authority on that. The themes of moral development, of ethical development, of world construction. One of the things I didn't talk about at all, which is extraordinarily useful work, is the work of writers like Anthony Putman about organizations and communities, breaking down the parameters there, which I've been using in teaching for quite a while, and students immediately find helpful. Making sense of themes in behavioral economics has been, in terms of if you have a limited number of motivations, then lots of behaviors look irrational. But if you have a broader sense of motivations, things that look irrational are no longer irrational. They're just done for different reasons than you want to, state at the get-go. The point of descriptive psychology was to begin with a map of the full set of possibilities without foreclosing on the possibilities. That's what the conceptualization is. What's the map of what's possible conceptually? Then the task is, well, let's see what actually happens out there in the world. And it turns out that most of the things happen over here and some of it over here. Then the question is, well, why these patterns? When you get to the question of why these patterns, that's where theory becomes important. Where you talk about, because then you can predict and explain how other things might follow. But so the descriptive job was the job of mapping out possibilities. The empirical job is to see which of these possibilities occur. The theoretical job is to figure out, well, why it occurred in that pattern and not some other pattern. So this job is the pre-empirical one, of identifying the subject matter, which is something, for some god-awful reason, psychology forgot to do.
Other questions, comments? enjoy, and thank you again so much.
Extremely well done.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Extremely well done.